My father died at 5:46 on a Monday evening. By 10:12 that same night, his wife had placed my suitcase on the front porch and hired a locksmith to drill through the dead bolt. Vanessa stood behind the screen door while I walked down the stairs carrying the navy overnight bag I had brought from Boston. "This house belongs to Sophie and me now," she said. "You need to stop pretending you still have a place here." The locksmith paused, looking between Vanessa and me, as though he had stepped into something he was not paid to understand. I had one bag, my laptop, a brass key, and a blue folder containing ownership documents for a commercial property Vanessa still believed belonged to my father. I could have opened the folder on the porch. I could have shown her the recorded deeds, operating agreements, tax filings, and the independent valuation sitting behind the first tab. Instead, I picked up my coat, stepped around the old lock lying on the bricks, and walked toward my car. Vanessa mistook my silence for surrender. What she did not understand was that I had stopped needing a place in her house years earlier, and within 11 days, she would sit inside a law office while my attorney placed 3 folders in front of her, each one containing proof that the woman she had spent 21 years pushing out of the family had never been as powerless as she assumed. Welcome back to Calm Deception Stories. If you believe the quietest person in the room may be the one who understands the most, please like this video and subscribe. Now let me tell you how one locked door uncovered 21 years of deception. The Monday before my father died, I drove 93 miles to his house for dinner. I had made the trip twice a month for 4 years, usually leaving my Boston office shortly after 4 and arriving before 6:30. Vanessa served dinner at exactly 6:30. She liked schedules because they gave her the impression that nothing important could happen without her approval. That evening, she had prepared chicken marsala, roasted potatoes, and green beans glazed with too much butter. The dining table was set with 3 linen napkins held by silver rings. There were 4 people in the room. Vanessa sat at one end of the table. My father, Robert Bennett, sat at the other. My stepsister Sophie occupied the chair beside her mother, scrolling through apartment listings on her phone even though she had no intention of moving out. My place had a paper napkin folded beside the plate. It was a small thing. So small that mentioning it would have made me sound petty. That was Vanessa's favorite kind of cruelty, the kind that vanished the moment anyone attempted to describe it. My father watched me take my seat. His left hand shook as he reached for his water glass. He had been diagnosed with advanced congestive heart failure 8 months earlier. Vanessa told relatives that his condition was stable, but I understood the numbers in his medical reports because my father had authorized me to access his patient portal before his health worsened. His ejection fraction had fallen again. His kidneys were under stress. He had lost 16 pounds since Christmas. Vanessa kept serving him food he barely touched and telling everyone his appetite would return once the weather improved. Halfway through dinner, he set down his fork and looked at me. "Did Elena finish the Riverside lease review?" Vanessa's knife stopped against her plate. "Robert," she said, "we agreed not to discuss business at dinner." He kept his eyes on me. "She sent the final report Friday," I answered. "The West Wing is fully renewed, and the laboratory agreed to the expansion option." A little tension left his shoulders. "Good. What's Riverside?" Sophie asked. She was still looking at her phone. "An old property matter," Vanessa replied, before either of us could answer. My father drew a breath. Vanessa reached for the potatoes. "Sophie, did that marketing company ever call you back?" The subject changed as efficiently as if she had closed a door. After dinner, I carried the plates into the kitchen. Vanessa never asked me to wash them. She simply left the room knowing I would. On the counter beside the fruit bowl was an envelope addressed to Robert Bennett, from Hart and Leone, the law firm responsible for his estate plan. The envelope had already been opened. Vanessa entered the kitchen, saw where I was looking, and slid it beneath a grocery flyer. "Estate paperwork," she said. "Your father becomes anxious whenever his doctors change his medication. Did he ask you to open it?" Her smile remained in place, but her eyes hardened. "I'm his wife, Claire. I manage his paperwork now." "That wasn't my question. You've always had difficulty respecting boundaries." The word almost made me laugh. Instead, I dried my hands and looked through the doorway. My father remained at the table. Sophie had gone upstairs, and he was staring at the empty chair across from him as though he had forgotten what he intended to do next. For a moment, I considered asking him to come outside with me. I wanted 5 minutes without Vanessa listening from the next room. I wanted to ask about the letter and whether she had been limiting his calls because he requested it or because isolation made her control easier. Before I could speak, he raised 2 fingers from the tabletop. It was the same gesture he had used since I was a child. It meant, I heard you. Sometimes it meant, not now. Too often, it meant, I know, but I am not going to stop it. I nodded, collected my coat, and left at 8:15. The smell of mushrooms and wine sauce followed me into the car. I opened the window, even though the March air was cold. That was the last dinner I ever ate with my father. My mother's name was Evelyn Bennett. She died from a cerebral aneurysm when I was 9 years old. I remember the morning before it happened more clearly than I remember the hospital. She stood at the kitchen counter wearing one of my father's blue shirts and cutting strawberries into a chipped white bowl. She tucked one behind my ear and said I looked like a summer queen. By midnight, she was gone. My father was 38 and had no idea how to raise a daughter who began checking every room to make sure the people she loved were still breathing. He did not know how to discuss grief. He could not braid hair, choose clothes for a school concert, or explain why terrible things happened to ordinary families. What he understood was property. Robert Bennett was a commercial appraiser. He could walk through an abandoned factory with broken windows and tell you which wall was load-bearing, how much the roof would cost to replace, and whether a proposed highway exit would double the land value within 10 years. On Saturdays, he took me with him. I carried his clipboard while he measured hallways, loading bays and stairwells. He taught me to read deeds, zoning maps, tax assessments, rent rolls, and inspection reports. He showed me how a building could appear worthless from the street while sitting on land that would someday become valuable. Paint is a promise, he told me, while we stood inside an empty warehouse. A deed is proof. Learn the difference. I wrote the sentence in the back of my math notebook. Those trips became the closest thing we had to conversations about love. Instead of discussing fear or grief, he taught me to identify structural cracks and slowed down whenever we passed a property my mother had once admired. When I was 11, he bought me a small brass drafting compass from an estate sale. It came in a wooden case lined with faded green velvet. Measure twice, he said as he placed it in my hands. Assume nothing. The compass had a dark stain near the hinge and one leg that loosened if I opened it too far. I kept it on my desk for the next 23 years. 1 year later, my father met Vanessa Cole at a fundraising dinner hosted by the regional hospital. Vanessa was 35, recently divorced, and raising a 3-year-old daughter named Sophie. She had glossy dark hair, carefully shaped eyebrows, and a way of remembering small details that made people feel instantly important. The first time she met me, she brought lemon cookies and asked which books I liked. I wanted her to stay. That was the part of the story I rarely admitted. I did not reject Vanessa from the beginning. I wanted another woman in the house. I wanted someone who understood why I needed a different dress for the spring concert and why my hair became impossible after swimming. For the first several months, she seemed to want me too. She placed notes in my lunch, attended a parent conference, and called Sophie and me, her 2 girls. Then she married my father. The changes began quietly enough that no single one seemed worth an argument. Vanessa replaced the framed photograph of my mother in the living room with a landscape painting because, according to her, the portrait made guests uncomfortable. The photograph moved to the hallway, then to my father's office, and finally into a box in the attic marked OL'd frames. She reorganized the kitchen and placed everything I used on the highest shelves, explaining that Sophie needed the lower cabinets because she was small. Whenever I questioned a decision, Vanessa explained it so calmly that I became the problem for noticing. Sophie is younger. Sophie has already experienced one broken family. Sophie needs stability. You're mature for your age, Claire. Maturity became the reason I was expected to surrender anything Sophie wanted. When I was 13, Vanessa converted half my bedroom into a play area because Sophie was afraid to sleep alone. 6 months later, Sophie moved into the room permanently. I was transferred to the narrow guest room above the garage. The ceiling sloped over the bed, and the heating vent rattled whenever the furnace started. In winter, the floor became so cold that I kept my shoes beside the mattress. My father helped move my desk. He carried the heavier boxes and avoided looking directly at me. Vanessa thinks this will help Sophie feel like we're one family, he said. What family am I in? He set the box down. For 1 second, pain crossed his face. I believed he might reverse the decision. Instead, he said, "You're strong enough to make this easier." That sentence followed me for years. People often praise the child who causes the least trouble. What they sometimes mean is that the child has learned, no one is coming when she asks for help. By the time I was 15, Vanessa had become the center of the house. She planned every holiday, controlled every invitation, and reviewed a detailed household spreadsheet with my father behind the closed door of his office. Sophie was occasionally invited to learn financial responsibility. I was not. When I asked my father why, he said Vanessa had suffered financially during her first marriage. Her former husband had left her with debt, an unaffordable leased car, and no savings. I understood why tracking money made her feel safe. But fear does not remain harmless when it is used to control everyone else. That Christmas, Vanessa mailed cards featuring a photograph of herself, my father, and Sophie standing in front of our fireplace. They wore matching cream sweaters. My father's hand rested on Sophie's shoulder. I had taken the picture. When our neighbor asked why I was not on the card, Vanessa laughed. Claire was studying. You know how teenagers are. I had not been studying. I had been standing 6 feet away, holding the camera. My father heard her. He looked down at the envelopes in his hands and said nothing. The following Saturday, he drove me to an abandoned commercial complex near the river. The property consisted of 3 brick buildings connected by enclosed walkways. Boarded windows faced a weed-filled parking lot, and a rusted sign near the entrance read, Riverside Exchange. My father owned 40%. 2 longtime partners owned the rest. Samuel Leland held 35%, and James Porter held 25%. My father had purchased his interest 2 years before marrying Vanessa, when the surrounding neighborhood was still considered undesirable. Leland and Porter wanted to sell, but he believed the city would eventually extend the medical district toward the river. We walked through the largest building with flashlights because the electricity had been disconnected. What do you see? He asked. Water damage. What else? Old wiring. The elevators need replacing. There's probably asbestos around those pipes. He waited. I looked through a broken window toward the hospital towers in the distance. The medical district is less than 2 miles away. He smiled. Exactly. In the car, he opened a folder containing a statement from an index fund established in my name. The opening contribution had been $7,500. The money came from a portion of my mother's life insurance proceeds that he had preserved separately after her death. The account was already worth a little more than $9,000. This is yours, he said. Vanessa does not manage it. Does she know? She knows your mother left money for your education. That's not what I asked. He looked through the windshield at the abandoned buildings. No, she doesn't know the details. I should have asked why he could protect me privately but not publicly. I should have demanded to know why he allowed Vanessa to remove my mother's photograph and take my room while he quietly built accounts she could not reach. At 15, I did not have the language for that contradiction. I only understood that he had handed me something solid. He taught me to read quarterly statements and calculate how regular contributions, reinvested dividends, and time could change the account. Before we left, he placed a brass key beside the investment statement. The north building still uses this for the side entrance, he said. Keep it. Why? Because someday, you'll need to remember that value isn't always visible from the road. For the next 3 years, he brought me to Riverside whenever he inspected the property. I learned every floor, utility room, roof hatch, and lease proposal, including how renewal options and deferred maintenance affected the property's real value. The redevelopment began during my senior year of high school. A medical laboratory signed the first long-term lease. A physical therapy network took half the west building. The city approved road improvements along the riverfront. The partners who had wanted to sell suddenly wanted to stay. On my 18th birthday, my father transferred 5 percentage points of his Riverside ownership to me. The gift was independently appraised, reported for tax purposes, recorded with the county, and reviewed by separate counsel. I was represented by a young attorney from another firm because he insisted no one should ever be able to claim I had not understood the transfer. Vanessa did not know. I left for college 6 weeks later. There was no dramatic goodbye. My father helped load 2 suitcases and a desk lamp into a used Honda. Vanessa stood on the porch beside Sophie and reminded me not to leave food in the refrigerator. My former bedroom became Sophie's dressing room before Thanksgiving. At college, I studied accounting and real estate finance. I discovered that numbers were not cold. A signature placed 2 days too late, an invoice rounded too neatly, a transfer divided into amounts just beneath a reporting threshold, each one told a story. I became fascinated by financial fraud. After graduation, I joined a regional forensic accounting firm in Boston. My first apartment faced a concrete wall. I furnished it through yard sales and saved nearly half of every paycheck. My father called every Sunday morning. We discussed Riverside, my investment account, lease renewals, tax assessments, construction budgets, and interest rates. He rarely asked about my personal life. I rarely asked why he remained silent when Vanessa treated me like a guest in my childhood home. We spoke through numbers because numbers were safer than apologies. Over the following 9 years, my father transferred or sold the rest of his Riverside interest to me in carefully documented stages. The final portion he owned was transferred 7 years before his death, while he was still healthy and actively working. By then, I owned 40% of the property. At 29, I purchased Samuel Leland's 35% interest using a combination of investment income, commercial financing, and distributions from Riverside. That brought my ownership to 75%. James Porter kept his remaining 25% until I was 32. When he retired to Arizona, I purchased his shares through a separately negotiated sale, supported by an independent appraisal. From that day forward, Riverside Exchange belonged entirely to me. The original 3-building complex had expanded after we acquired 2 adjacent parcels. It became a 5-building commercial campus with medical offices, laboratories, a rehabilitation center, an architectural firm, and a small business incubator. Its value rose to more than $17 million. My original investment fund grew as well. I contributed every month, reinvested every dividend, and used part of the returns to purchase minority interests in 6 smaller commercial properties. By the time I was 34, the combined value of my assets had reached approximately $26,400,000. I did not live like a woman with $26 million. I drove a 6-year-old car. I rented an apartment near my office. I bought good shoes because I spent long hours standing in courtrooms and conference rooms, but there was nothing about my appearance that announced wealth. Vanessa interpreted simplicity as failure. She never asked what I did beyond telling people that Claire worked with spreadsheets. She assumed I was a salaried employee with no husband, no children, and no significant life of my own. Whenever my father mentioned Riverside, she treated it as one of his old business interests. He never corrected her. That silence protected the property, but it did not protect me. The distinction mattered. My father was diagnosed with advanced heart failure 8 months before his death. Vanessa transformed herself into the gatekeeper of his life. At first, her control looked like care. She organized his medication in labeled boxes, recorded his blood pressure, and attended every appointment. She kept a notebook filled with dietary rules and instructions from his cardiologist. Then she began deciding who could speak to him. If I called, she answered his phone. He's sleeping. The doctor said no stress. He doesn't have enough energy for a long conversation. If I offered to visit, the timing was always wrong. During one trip, I arrived without calling. Vanessa opened the door but left the security chain in place. Your father had a difficult morning, she said. I drove 2 hours. I'll sit quietly. He doesn't want company. This is exactly the pressure the cardiologist warned us about. Behind her, I could see my father seated at the kitchen table. He turned toward the door. Vanessa shifted sideways, blocking my view. I'll tell him you came. She closed the door. I remained on the porch until the hallway light disappeared beneath it. That evening, I called my Aunt Ruth, my father's older sister. Ruth was 71 and had spent 35 years teaching high school history. She believed in written evidence, uncomfortable questions, and never trusting anyone who described herself as the only person holding a family together. Vanessa has been telling people you're too busy to visit, Ruth said. I've called 11 times this month. I know, Robert knows too. Then why doesn't he stop her? Ruth took a breath. Your father has spent his life solving the problems he understands, and avoiding the ones he doesn't. That isn't an answer. It's the only honest one I have. Then she told me Vanessa had persuaded my father to sign a limited financial power of attorney. The document allowed her to pay household expenses and manage certain accounts if his condition worsened. Which accounts? I asked. His checking account and individual money market account, nothing related to Riverside or anything in your name. I contacted my attorney the next morning. Elena Marquez had represented me for 7 years through Marquez Asset Counsel, a firm unaffiliated with Hart and Leone. She was 50, precise, and almost impossible to surprise. She reviewed every deed, transfer, tax filing, operating agreement, and brokerage designation. "Everything under your name is insulated," she said. "Vanessa cannot access Riverside. She cannot access your portfolio. She cannot reverse completed transfers." "What about my father's estate?" "That will be administered by Hart and Leone under his current will." "I don't want Vanessa's house." "I know. I don't want to fight over furniture or bank accounts." "That doesn't mean she won't create a fight." Elena recommended that we prepare a complete ownership chronology before my father's condition deteriorated further. She simply made sure every document could be found in one place if someone later tried to rewrite the history. The blue folder in my safe came from that review. 3 weeks later, my father collapsed in the kitchen and was admitted to the hospital. Vanessa called Sophie, Ruth, 2 cousins, their pastor, and several neighbors. She did not call me. A nurse found my number, listed as an emergency contact in an older section of his medical record. She reached me shortly after midnight. I drove through heavy rain and arrived just before 2. Vanessa met me outside the cardiac unit. "You can't go in," she said. "I'm his daughter. He's sedated." "Then I'll sit beside him." "Immediate family only." For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood her. "I am immediate family." Vanessa folded her arms. "You know what I mean." Ruth appeared behind her. "No," she said. "I don't think any of us know what you mean." The argument drew the attention of a nurse. She checked the chart, confirmed I was authorized to visit, and allowed me inside for 10 minutes. My father looked smaller beneath the hospital blankets. Tubes disappeared beneath his gown, and the monitor above him traced each uneven heartbeat in green light. I sat beside him and placed my hand over his. His eyes opened briefly. "Riverside?" he whispered. "It's fine." "The east roof?" The inspection passed. A faint smile crossed his face. There were 100 honest things I wanted to say. I wanted to ask why he had allowed me to spend half my life feeling like an intruder. I wanted to tell him money had never replaced hearing him defend me. I wanted him to admit that protecting my future in secret had been easier than confronting Vanessa in public. None of those questions belonged in the 10 minutes a nurse had given us. "You prepared everything correctly," I said. His fingers tightened around mine. "Measure twice," he whispered. Then his eyes closed. He was discharged 6 days later. Vanessa took him home and restricted visitors more aggressively than before. She told relatives I had returned to Boston because work mattered more to me than family. Ruth corrected the story whenever she heard it, but lies travel quickly when they confirm what people already believe. I saw my father once during the following month. I stood outside the kitchen window while Vanessa insisted he was too tired to open the door. He looked up from the table and raised 2 fingers. I pressed my palm against the glass. That was our goodbye. His heart stopped the following Monday. The hospital called me at 5:51 p.m., 5 minutes after the doctor recorded his time of death. I sat at my desk with the phone against my ear and watched the city move beyond the window. Buses stopped. Pedestrians crossed the street. A man in a red jacket laughed into his phone. The world did not pause. I thanked the doctor, closed my laptop, collected the blue folder from my safe, and drove to my father's house. Cars lined both sides of the street. Vanessa had already called relatives and neighbors. Food covered the kitchen counters. White flowers stood in a vase beside the sink. Upstairs, I placed my overnight bag in the room where I had once slept. The space had become what Vanessa called a meditation room. Scented candles stood where my desk had been. I sat on the edge of the narrow daybed. Vanessa appeared in the doorway within minutes. "You can't stay here." I looked up. "Tonight? This is Sophie's space. Sophie has a bedroom. She uses this room. My father died 4 hours ago. And I have just lost my husband. I'm not taking anything from you, Vanessa. I need somewhere to sleep. You have an apartment. 93 miles away." She pressed her lips together. "The house passes to me. Your father made that clear. Sophie and I need privacy." The speed of it stunned me more than the words. My father's body was still at the hospital. Yet Vanessa was already arranging the world as though his death were an administrative transition she had rehearsed. I stood and picked up my bag. Downstairs, Sophie was beside the staircase, holding a mug with both hands. At 25, she was old enough to understand what was happening. She looked at me, then at her mother. Her lips parted, but no words came out. A locksmith was removing equipment from his van when I stepped onto the porch. Vanessa had called him before I arrived. The old lock lay on the brick walkway. "This is my home now," she said behind me. You need to stop pretending you still belong here. I felt the Riverside key inside my coat pocket. The answer could have been delivered in numbers, but that porch was not the right place. The truth deserved a table, documents, witnesses, and enough silence for every person in the room to understand what had changed. I placed my bag in the car and drove away. The nearest hotel with a vacancy was the Briarwood Inn, 6 miles from the house. The hallway smelled faintly of bleach and burnt coffee. My room faced the parking lot, where a broken lamp flashed throughout the night. Sleep never came. At 2 in the morning, I opened my laptop and reviewed Riverside's financial statements. The numbers were unchanged. My father was gone. Grief did not care what I owned. It sat beside me in a hotel room with a stained carpet and reminded me of every conversation we would never finish. Around 3:30, I found the first transfer my father had signed on my 18th birthday. Beneath the notary seal, he had added a handwritten line with no legal purpose. Do your own math. Trust the record. The folder protected my future, but it could not return the years he had allowed Vanessa to erase. The funeral took place 4 days later at St. Matthew's Church. Vanessa and Sophie occupied the center of the front row. Vanessa's handbag rested on one chair, and her coat covered the chair beside it. No seat had been reserved for me. I sat in the third row. Ruth arrived just before the service and walked past Vanessa without acknowledging her. She sat beside me and took my hand. Your father prepared more than she understands, she whispered. I know about Riverside. This isn't only about Riverside. I looked at her. Ruth's eyes were red, but her voice remained steady. He updated the will 11 months ago. He told me he wanted no ambiguity. The pastor described my father as a careful man who expressed love through responsibility. A former colleague spoke about his ability to recognize value before anyone else saw it. Vanessa delivered the final eulogy. She talked about 21 years of marriage, hospital visits, Sunday breakfasts, and the home they had built together. She mentioned Sophie 4 times. She never said my name. In the parking lot afterward, one of my father's former partners approached me. Why weren't you sitting with the family? He asked. There wasn't a chair. He looked toward Vanessa, who was accepting condolences beside the hearse. His expression changed. Before leaving, Vanessa gathered several relatives near the church steps. Robert was very clear about the house, she announced. It was our marital home. Sophie and I will remain there, exactly as he intended. No one had asked. She was speaking loudly enough for me to hear. I allowed the statement to pass unanswered. The formal estate meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, 10 days after my father's death. The morning after the funeral, Vanessa began searching. She hired an appraiser to value the house. It was worth approximately $460,000 and had no mortgage. She contacted First Commonwealth and confirmed that Robert held a personal savings account containing $132,000. Under his will, that account was designated for her. Their joint household checking account, with a much smaller balance, passed to her automatically through survivorship and was never part of probate. Vanessa then searched my father's office, opened filing cabinets, and removed boxes from the attic. According to Sophie, she spent hours looking for current records connected to Riverside Exchange. She found old inspection reports, photographs, and lease proposals. She found tax documents from years when my father still owned an interest. What she did not find was a current deed bearing his name. On Sunday evening, she called me. Her voice was unusually gentle. Claire, I hope you're doing all right. It was the first time she had asked how I was since my father died. I'm managing. I've been organizing Robert's documents. I waited. There was a property near the river, she continued. Riverside Exchange. Yes. Do you know where he kept the ownership records? Yes. The silence between us changed. Could you bring them to me? The attorneys already have the necessary documents. I'm his wife. I know. I have a right to understand what he owned. Jonathan Hart will explain the estate Thursday. I don't want to wait. Tell me now. The meeting is the appropriate place. Her voice sharpened. You've always resented me, Claire. Even when you were a child, you acted as if I had taken something from you. I looked at the flashing parking lot lamp beyond my window. You changed the locks while my father's body was still at the hospital. That house is legally mine. Then the house isn't what you're worried about. She hung up. Less than a minute later, my phone rang again. I let it go to voicemail. She called 4 more times that night. The following morning, I met Elena at Marquez Asset Council. She had prepared a consolidated report. $17,600,000 for Riverside. $3,800,000 in my investment portfolio, $4,900,000 in other properties, and $100,000 in operating reserves, a total of $26,400,000. Every asset was in my name. None belonged to my father's probate estate. Elena confirmed that Robert's final transfer had occurred 7 years earlier, long before his diagnosis, and that his current will had been signed with independent counsel and documented capacity. Vanessa would receive the house, personal savings, joint checking account, and estate residue. Sophie's bequest, 2 charitable gifts, and final expenses would be paid from the money market account. She is well protected, Elena said. She is panicking because she expected Riverside. I looked at the ownership folders. Legally, only Riverside was relevant to any question about my father's former assets. My other investments were private and had no place in his probate proceeding. But I knew what Vanessa would claim once she learned the building was mine. She would say every dollar I possessed had been diverted from my father, that I had manipulated him, and that my silence proved guilt. Prepare the complete report, I told Elena. If she accuses me of taking from the estate, I want everyone to see the origin of every asset. You understand you are not required to disclose the rest of your finances. I understand. I am authorizing it for this meeting only. Elena nodded and added the consolidated valuation to the third folder. That afternoon, Ruth called to report that Vanessa had used the expired power of attorney to withdraw $96,000 from Robert's money market account. Sophie had been present. Vanessa told the bank employee that Robert was alive but too sick to attend, despite already possessing certified copies of his death certificate. I called Elena immediately. Jonathan Hart had submitted formal notice of my father's death that morning, but the withdrawal occurred 90 minutes before it reached the branch. The cashier's check went into a new account belonging only to Vanessa. The funeral cost $10,400. That left $85,600 improperly removed from an estate account intended to cover Sophie's bequest, 2 charitable gifts, final expenses, and the residuary distribution. The bank is freezing the receiving account pending review, Elena said. Jonathan will demand that the money be restored. Do not warn her before Thursday. Elena understood. Everyone would receive one version of the truth. Thursday arrived with cold rain. Hart and Leone occupied the 3rd floor of a brick building across from the county courthouse. Its conference room overlooked maple trees stripped bare by winter. Vanessa arrived first. She wore a black suit, pearl earrings, and the expression of someone attending a meeting she believed was ceremonial. Sophie sat beside her in a gray cardigan. Ruth sat near the middle of the table, across from my father's cousins Peter and Mark. I entered with Elena. Vanessa's eyes fixed on her. Who is this? Elena Marquez. She represents me. For what? My assets. This is a family matter. Elena placed her briefcase beside her chair. It is also a legal matter. Jonathan Hart entered carrying a thick estate file. He was 63, silver-haired, and deliberate in every movement. He waited until everyone was seated. Before I read Robert Bennett's will, he said, I need to explain the distinction between his probate estate, non-probate accounts, and property transferred during his lifetime. Vanessa leaned back. I understand estate law well enough. Jonathan looked over his glasses. Then, this should be straightforward. He began with the will. To my wife, Vanessa Cole Bennett, I leave the marital residence at 18 Hawthorne Drive, free of mortgage or other encumbrance. I further leave to her the balance of my personal savings account at First Commonwealth Bank. Vanessa pressed her palm against the table. Jonathan explained that the household checking account had already passed to her outside probate because it was jointly held with survivorship rights. Her posture relaxed slightly. To my stepdaughter, Sophie Cole, I leave $25,000 from my individual money market account. Sophie glanced at her mother. Vanessa's jaw tightened, but she remained quiet. Jonathan continued. Robert had left $15,000 to the hospice organization that supported him after his first hospitalization and $10,000 to a scholarship fund for students studying commercial real estate. Funeral expenses, final medical obligations, taxes, and administrative costs were also to be paid from the money market account. Any remaining residue would pass to Vanessa. Jonathan read several provisions concerning personal belongings and named Ruth the recipient of my father's collection of antique maps. Then he lowered the will. That constitutes the disposition of Robert Bennett's probate estate. Vanessa frowned. The house and the accounts? Yes. What about Riverside Exchange? Jonathan removed his glasses. Riverside Exchange is not part of Robert's estate. Then where is it? Elena opened her briefcase. Vanessa turned toward me. You knew. I met her eyes but offered no answer. Jonathan folded his hands. 16 years ago, Robert Bennett executed the first of several documented transfers involving his separate interest in Riverside Exchange. Each transaction was completed during his lifetime, with formal valuation, tax reporting, recorded ownership documents, and independent representation. To whom? Vanessa asked. The clock above the door ticked twice. Jonathan looked at me. To his daughter, Claire Bennett. No one moved. Rain struck the windows in a steady pattern. Vanessa stared at him. That's impossible. Elena removed the first folder and placed it on the table. This contains the gift transfer executed when Claire turned 18. Robert transferred 5 percentage points of his Riverside interest to her. Claire was represented by independent counsel. A second folder followed. These are the subsequent transfer agreements through which Robert conveyed or sold the remainder of his interest to Claire over the following 9 years. Robert's final Riverside interest left his ownership 7 years before his death, well before his heart condition was diagnosed. Vanessa stood so quickly that her chair struck the wall. He would never do that without telling me. He was not legally required to obtain your permission, Jonathan said. His Riverside interest was acquired before your marriage, maintained separately, and transferred through properly documented transactions. I was his wife for 21 years. No one is disputing your marriage. Then how could he hide this from me? Ruth answered before Jonathan could. Because he knew you would try to control it. Vanessa turned toward her. You knew? I knew Claire owned part of Riverside. For how long? Long enough to understand why Robert kept the records outside your reach. Vanessa looked at Peter and Mark, searching for agreement. Neither cousin spoke. Elena placed the third folder on the table. This contains 2 transactions that did not involve Robert. 5 years ago, Claire purchased Samuel Leland's 35% interest through a commercially financed sale. 2 years ago, she purchased James Porter's final 25% interest through a separate transaction supported by an independent appraisal. She opened the folder. Since that final purchase, Claire Bennett has owned 100% of Riverside Exchange. Sophie's lips parted. Vanessa remained standing, one hand gripping the back of her chair. At Claire's written request, Elena continued, I have also prepared a limited disclosure documenting the origin of her other assets. She is not legally required to reveal this information in Robert's probate proceeding. She authorized the disclosure because she anticipated an allegation that her property had been diverted from Robert's estate. Vanessa looked at me. Why would you anticipate that? Because I know you, I said. Elena turned to the valuation. Riverside Exchange currently consists of 5 commercial buildings with 38 tenants. Its most recent independent valuation is $17,600,000. Peter leaned back slowly. Mark removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Elena continued. Claire also owns an investment portfolio originating from a fund established with a portion of her late mother's life insurance proceeds. The portfolio is currently valued at approximately $3,800,000. She turned another page. In addition, Claire holds equity interests in 6 commercial properties across 4 states, valued at $4,900,000. Her holding company maintains $100,000 in operating reserves. Elena placed the consolidated report in front of Vanessa. The total documented value of Claire Bennett's assets is approximately $26,400,000. The room became completely still. Sophie lowered her eyes. Vanessa looked at me as if 21 years of assumptions were rearranging themselves behind her face. You sat at my table, she said. Yes. You let me think you were barely getting by. I never said that. You drove an old car, rented an apartment, and let me believe you had nothing. You never asked. You only assumed. Her voice rose. You deceived me. For years, I had imagined what I might feel if Vanessa finally discovered the truth. Triumph was not part of it. I felt tired. You never asked what I did, I said. You never asked what I owned, what I built, or why Dad called me about Riverside. You decided I was unimportant and treated your assumption as evidence. I gave you a home. You gave my room to Sophie. She was a child. So was I. Vanessa looked at Jonathan. These transfers can be challenged. Robert was sick, she influenced him. Elena's voice remained level. The final transfer from Robert occurred 7 years before his death, while he was healthy, employed, and independently represented. Claire's later purchases came from 2 unrelated partners. Robert had no ownership interest left to transfer during his illness. She manipulated him for years. Every transaction was appraised, reported, and reviewed. With money he gave her, Claire financed the outside purchases through her own income, distributions from assets she already owned, and commercial loans she personally guaranteed. Vanessa turned toward me. Your father would not have done this to me. He left you a mortgage-free house, a personal savings account, the joint checking account, and the remainder of the estate after its obligations are paid. He gave you $26 million. He gave me an opportunity. I built the rest. Jonathan cleared his throat. There is another matter. Vanessa stopped. Elena removed a bank statement from her briefcase. 3 days ago, $96,000 was withdrawn from Robert Bennett's individual money market account. Sophie closed her eyes. The withdrawal was made using a financial power of attorney, Elena continued. That authority terminated automatically at Robert's death. Vanessa sat down. I needed money for the funeral. The documented funeral expenses were $10,400. There were other costs. Please identify them. I don't have every receipt with me. The full $96,000 was deposited into a personal account opened solely in your name. Vanessa looked at Sophie. You told them? Sophie's eyes filled with tears. I called Aunt Ruth because I didn't understand. You had no right. He was already dead, Mom. I was protecting us. From what? Vanessa did not answer. Jonathan placed both hands on the table. The money market account was intended to fund Sophie's $25,000 bequest, 2 charitable gifts, funeral expenses, final obligations, and estate administration. Only the remainder, if any, would pass to you. I would have paid everything. You removed the entire balance before the will was administered. I was his wife. That did not authorize you to use an expired power of attorney. The bank approved it. The bank approved the transaction because you represented that Robert was alive and unable to attend in person, Elena said. You already possessed certified copies of his death certificate. Vanessa's face lost its color. The rain grew louder against the glass. Jonathan spoke carefully. You should retain independent legal counsel before making further statements. The bank has frozen the receiving account, and the estate will formally demand restoration of the funds. Vanessa looked around the table. I gave that man 21 years of my life. No one interrupted her. I drove him to appointments, organized his medicine, and slept in a hospital chair. My first husband left me with debt and a 3-year-old child. Robert promised I would never be helpless again. Jonathan's expression softened, but his answer did not. He honored that promise. You are receiving a paid-off home, a substantial savings account, joint funds, and the estate residue after valid obligations are satisfied. He gave her everything that mattered. Ruth leaned forward. No, Vanessa. He made sure Claire kept what belonged to Claire. You think I would have taken it from her? Ruth's expression changed. You changed the locks before Robert's body left the hospital. Vanessa opened her mouth. Ruth continued. You removed Evelyn's photographs. You gave away Claire's room. You left her out of family cards, financial conversations, hospital visits, and finally her own father's funeral row. I raised her. You tolerated her presence when it was convenient. That is not true. Robert should have stopped you, Ruth said. He didn't. That failure belongs to him. But he also knew that if Claire's future depended on your willingness to share, she would receive nothing. Vanessa turned toward me. Did he say that? I thought about the Saturday inspections, the brass compass, and the key resting beside the first investment statement. He didn't need to. For the first time since entering the room, Vanessa appeared smaller than the authority she had built around herself. I didn't know, she whispered. That was true. She knew almost nothing about the work I did, the years I spent reviewing leases, or the loans I carried to purchase the final partnership shares. Learning about me had never benefited her, so she had treated ignorance as certainty. I stood. Everyone looked at me. I did not come here to take Vanessa's house, I said. I will not contest the will. I am not asking for the savings account, the checking account, the residue, or any of Dad's belongings. Vanessa stared at the folders. From this point forward, questions about Riverside or my investments will go through Elena. Estate matters will go through Jonathan. I will not discuss either privately. Sophie wiped her face. Claire. I looked at her. She had watched me carry my suitcase down the stairs. She had watched her mother remove my photographs, take my room, and exclude me from the funeral row. She had been a child for some of it, not all of it. I'm sorry, she said. I believe you're sorry now. The words hurt her. But truth does not become cruelty because it arrives late. I picked up my coat. At the door, Vanessa finally looked up. You think that money makes you better than us? No. Then what do you want? For most of my life, I had wanted one place at the table, one photograph on the wall, one moment when my father would speak before Vanessa decided what everyone was allowed to believe. I no longer wanted any of it badly enough to trade away my peace. You told me the house was yours, I said. Keep it. I was never fighting for the house. Then what were you fighting for? I spent years waiting for someone in that family to admit I belonged there. I opened the door. I'm done waiting. Elena followed me into the hallway. The elevator took too long, so we walked down the stairs. My shoes struck each step with a steady, even sound. Outside, the rain had stopped. Ruth caught up with us near the entrance and pulled me into her arms. Your father should have defended you while he was alive, she said. It was the first time anyone had said it without making an excuse for him. Yes, he loved you. I know. Both things can be true. That was the hardest part. My father had loved me. He had also failed me. $26 million did not erase the Christmas card, the locked door, the paper napkin, or the last month when I had been forced to see him through a window. His careful transfers were acts of love, but they were also evidence that he understood the danger and chose a private solution instead of an honest confrontation. I could appreciate what he built and still grieve what he refused to say. 3 weeks later, Vanessa hired an estate litigation attorney. He reviewed every deed, appraisal, tax filing, operating agreement, medical record, and independent representation letter. Within 9 days, he advised her that there was no credible basis for challenging my ownership. My father's final Riverside interest had left his name 7 years before his death. My purchases from Leland and Porter had no connection to the estate. The investment fund originated from my mother's insurance proceeds and had remained separate. The bank issue was resolved differently. Vanessa returned $85,600, representing the amount exceeding documented funeral costs. The bank restored those funds to the estate account and completed an internal review of its employees' failure to verify my father's status. Jonathan used the account to satisfy Sophie's bequest, the hospice donation, the scholarship gift, administrative expenses, and remaining obligations. After restitution, the estate declined to pursue a civil claim. The bank documented Vanessa's false representation, tightened its power of attorney controls, and made no criminal referral. No charges were filed. Vanessa ultimately received the lawful residue. She kept the house. She kept the personal savings account. She kept the joint checking account. She did not lose everything. She lost control over the story she had told about me. For years, she had described me as selfish and too busy to care. The family now knew I had called repeatedly, driven to the house, monitored his health with permission, and remained involved in Riverside. Several relatives and neighbors apologized for accepting Vanessa's version. I answered some messages and ignored others. An apology did not automatically create access. Sophie sent me a handwritten letter. She did not defend herself. She described the moments she remembered. The Christmas photograph, the bedroom, the funeral row, and the night I left with my suitcase. I told myself I wasn't responsible because Mom made the decisions, she wrote. But I benefited every time she pushed you out. Eventually, staying silent became a decision too. I read the letter 3 times. For several weeks, I left it unanswered. Then I sent one message. I appreciate that you told the truth. I'm not ready to have a relationship, but I'm willing to speak when I am. She replied, I'll wait. For once, no one demanded that I become comfortable according to someone else's schedule. 8 months after my father died, I left the forensic accounting firm and opened Bennett Forensic and Valuation Group on the 4th floor of Riverside's East Building. The office overlooked the river. Morning light moved across the exposed brick walls, and freight trains passed on the opposite bank twice a day. I hired 6 people during the first year, including 2 women returning to finance after leaving abusive marriages. We specialized in tracing hidden assets, investigating internal fraud, and helping small business owners understand agreements they had been pressured to sign. Ruth visited most Fridays. She brought coffee and corrected the grammar in our client newsletters, whether anyone asked her to or not. Sophie and I eventually met at a quiet cafe near the river. We did not call it reconciliation or pretend one conversation could repair 21 years. She had moved out, begun therapy, and taken a job with a nonprofit housing organization. When she asked whether I had forgiven her, I answered honestly, not completely. She accepted the boundary, and we agreed to meet again. On the first anniversary of my firm, I hosted a dinner in Riverside's restored courtyard. Ruth arrived early with bread from her favorite bakery. Elena brought wine. My employees came with spouses, children, and more dessert than anyone could eat. Sophie arrived carrying a bowl of strawberries. She placed it on the table and looked at me. I didn't know what else to bring. For one instant, I saw my mother standing at the kitchen counter in my father's blue shirt, tucking a strawberry behind my ear. I smiled. They're perfect. There were 14 people at the table. Before we ate, I counted the place settings. Not because I feared someone had forgotten me, because I had prepared them. Every chair was filled. No one needed to search the kitchen for a paper napkin. No one had to prove the right to remain. The brass compass sat inside its wooden case on a small table near my office door. The green velvet had faded almost gray, and the loose leg still shifted if it opened too far. Beside it was the old Riverside key. My father had taught me to look beneath appearances and measure value carefully. Life had taught me something he never could. A person should not have to shrink to earn a place in her own family. Silence may prevent an argument, but repeated silence eventually becomes permission. And a locked door only has power if you still believe everything you need is waiting behind it. Ruth raised her glass. To Claire, she said, who understood the value of this place before the rest of us understood the value of her. I looked around the table. For years, I believed justice would feel like watching the people who hurt me lose everything. It did not. Justice felt like knowing they could no longer decide who I was. It felt like keeping the door open for people who approached with honesty, and closing it when they arrived with entitlement. It felt like building a life large enough that the room I lost no longer mattered. My father taught me how to measure the value of buildings. I had to learn how to measure the value of my own presence. My name is Claire Bennett. My stepmother changed the locks because she believed losing my father had left me with nowhere to go. She was wrong. I had spent years building a place no one could remove me from, not Riverside Exchange, not my company, and not any house listed on a deed. I had built it inside myself. If Claire's story reminded you that silence is not weakness and boundaries are not cruelty, please like this video, subscribe to Calm Deception Stories, and share it with someone who needs the courage to recognize their own worth.